Breakfast. Some call it the most important meal of the day, and sometimes there's nothing better than enjoying one topped with the sweetness of maple syrup. The process of getting that syrup from tree to table is a long one, and it's very dependent on the weather. According to the USDA, Pennsylvania ranks as a top 8 maple producer in the United States, producing 165,000 gallons of syrup in 2021. And it's our climate that makes it possible. While maples can be found as far south as Florida, maple sap, which is the base from which syrup is made, can only be extracted from trees at certain temperatures. That's because these trees have an intricate system of water flowing through them, similar to that of a human circulatory system.
When you look at this thing, it's essentially a straw. And what's being set up then is during the growing season, kind of a water gradient, whereby the trees are trying to maintain about 100% moisture or water inside the stems and inside the cells. And then outside, as the atmosphere becomes anything less than 100% humidity-wise, that sets up that gradient. And the trees really can't stop. There's mechanisms, occasional mechanisms they've developed in lineages, but they really can't stop the passive flow of moisture through that gradient.
It's because of this cycle that early spring is when peak sap flow occurs. As temperatures rise above freezing during the day, sap inside of the tree begins to thaw and move through the trunk, also known as the stem. At night, when temperatures dip below freezing, water is drawn back into the tree from the roots, which keeps the system flowing.
And so that is what sets up that pressure differential that drives kind of that movement in the stem as this embolisms form, right? These little oxygen bubbles in the stem as things are waking up, going to sleep, waking up, going to sleep kind of thing, and respiring in the process. At night, the moisture will move from the root system into the stem. And then during the day, as the stem warms up, it starts to move the moisture around the stems and sometimes back to the root or out to some of the tissues or to the developing branches. It just depends on what time of the season. It's about a 6 to 8 week process here.
And it's not just the changes in temperature this time of year that get the sap flowing. There's also another atmospheric phenomenon that plays a major role.
Because these trees are functioning off of this complicated movement of water that's driven by atmospheric conditions and day length and so on, one of the things they tend to do is gush a little bit more ahead of an incoming front. You get this kind of pressure differential, barometric change, whatever it is that's in the atmosphere that birds recognize, the trees are recognizing it too and responding to it. And so you'll get oftentimes some of your best sap flows ahead of changing weather conditions.
Other tree species in the northeast U.S. also go through similar cycling, but their sugar content differs from that of maples, so production of their syrup isn't nearly as high.
You'll find that people in Pennsylvania and New York and other places are starting to make walnut syrup. So we have walnuts, we have birches, and people are playing around with sycamores and beeches as well at this point. So a number of different species that have been discovered to have this kind of cycling going on, as well as an agreeable flavor and some sugar content that are being investigated.
That cycling allows for prime sap collection in the late winter and early spring. The sap flow ends as the maples begin to bud and temperatures are no longer dipping below freezing on a nightly basis, which is why the season typically lasts 6 to 8 weeks here in Pennsylvania. However, in years with an early thaw, like in March of 2012, the season may end much more abruptly.
These spile holes just dried up, and the trees never produced any more sap for the rest of the season. It was just too warm, and it just conditioned those trees to say, I'm about ready to break bud, so it's time to transition. And so it's interesting how they will respond to those kinds of erratic temperatures, especially if they're really abnormal.
Those shortened seasons can have a big economic impact on maple producers.
In the near term, it's this kind of stochastic stuff that we've got going on where one year will be great for sap flow and we have perfect conditions like we've traditionally experienced. And then the next year, we get temperatures all over the place, right? That kind of thing, if you're a serious commercial producer, is not just disruptive, but it's hard to count on the income to make those investments, right, over time, because it does add up.
The investments are in the form of equipment, spiles and buckets or tubing for when you tap, and evaporators, which are machines used to turn the sap into syrup. These can cost anywhere from a few $1,000s for hobbyists to up to $500,000 for working farms.
The equipment and the technology, if you start to invest in it, can add up very quickly. And so as a result, these irregular seasonal conditions that we're having in the near term make it unpredictable and rather risky for a lot of people to get in this in a serious way.
As temperatures continue to rise over time, experts worry that there may be a long-term impact on maple production here in Pennsylvania.
But for us, we're right at that zone where, we're going to be changing gardening zones really quickly within the next 50 to 100 years. And what that means is these sugar maples are just going to migrate along that gradient. And so in many parts of the southern areas of the state that are at lower elevations, it probably won't have enough sugar maple in the long term or enough of a season to make it worthwhile.
So the next time you sit down to enjoy a breakfast complete with maple sweetness, remember how much the weather and climate played a role in getting it on your plate. For Weather World, I'm Marissa Ferger.